The sound of metal crunching against wood echoed through the crisp morning air. John Matthews, a black rancher in the rolling outskirts of Southern California, froze mid-step. His eyes shot toward the edge of his property, where the mailbox he had built himself now lay twisted and shattered. Again, it wasn't an accident. It had never been an accident. Over the past 6 months, someone, or more accurately, a group of someones, had made it their personal mission to destroy John's mailbox. And every time, he watched from his porch, simmering in quiet fury. This wasn't a random act of vandalism. This was deliberate, calculated, and according to the HOA, it wasn't their problem. The Matthews Ranch wasn't enormous, but it had enough land to give him a sense of freedom he'd never felt in the cramped apartment complexes he grew up in Los Angeles. He had poured sweat and pride into this place, planting fruit trees, restoring an old barn, and yes, crafting the perfect mailbox, a custom-built post with his initials carved in steel, a symbol of his hard work and independence. And yet, it kept getting obliterated. John stomped down the steps, the wooden boards creaking under his weight. The smell of fresh-cut grass mingled with the faint scent of gasoline from the neighbor's tractor. His jaw tightened as he stared at the wreckage. Shards of wood and bent metal glinted in the sun like tiny daggers. Not again, he muttered, voice low but firm. Behind him, his teenage daughter, Mia, peeked from the kitchen window. Her eyes were wide, a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Dad, are you okay?" she asked. John forced a smile. "I'm fine, Mia. Just tired of fixing the same thing over and over." She didn't buy it. She never did. And that was okay. Part of being a parent, John reminded himself, was holding the line even when your heart was racing. He grabbed his toolbox and began inspecting the damage. The screws were bent, the post was cracked, and the nameplate had been ripped clean off. Whoever did this knew exactly how to inflict the most irritation with the least effort. It started months ago, a small annoyance. The HOA had been sending letters about the mailbox not meeting community standards. At first, John tried to comply. He adjusted, repainted, even consulted the HOA's vague guidelines. And still, the mailbox kept getting hit, knocked down, or shattered in ways that looked too intentional to be accidents. The first time it happened, he thought it was just a neighbor being careless. But then it happened again, and again, and every single time, the culprits were never caught, never reported, never disciplined, just whispers at HOA meetings, excuses, and thinly veiled smiles from those who, John suspected, thought they were putting him in his place. And here's the thing, John wasn't looking for a fight. He just wanted to live in peace, to tend to his land, and to raise Mia in a safe environment. But peace had a cost. Every smashed mailbox chipped away at it. Every call to the HOA ended with the same line: "We can't take responsibility for personal property damage on your lot. Maybe it's time to get a security camera," Mia suggested, appearing at the back door now, arms crossed. John shook his head. "And let them know exactly when I'm home? No, I'll find another way." He wiped his hands on a rag, glancing at the road leading out of his property. It was quiet now, the distant hum of a delivery truck in the valley below the only interruption. But he knew it wouldn't stay quiet. Not for long. Whoever was behind this had patterns, routines. They liked to make sure he saw it, felt it, every single time. And John wasn't blind to the racial undertones of it. In this affluent, mostly white neighborhood, he stood out, not just for the color of his skin, but for the fact that he had dared to buy land, build a home, and assert his presence in a community that had no interest in welcoming him. He remembered the first HOA meeting he attended. The room smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. The president, a tall woman with icy eyes, had asked him, "Are you sure this property is zoned correctly for your activities?" Her voice was polite, but her tone dripped with condescension. Everyone laughed politely. John had smiled, nodded, and left, feeling the weight of their judgment pressed down on him like the heavy summer heat. Now, months later, the laughter was gone, replaced by this silent war over a mailbox. John knelt down, examining the splintered wood. He pressed his fingers against the edges, feeling the grain and the cracks. There was a rhythm to it, a story told through jagged lines and twisted metal. Whoever did this didn't respect his space, his property, or his dignity. Something inside him snapped, not in anger, not in fear, but in resolve. He stood, squinting at the horizon. The sun was rising higher, spilling gold over his ranch. The birds chirped as if oblivious to the human drama below. But John wasn't oblivious. He had a plan forming in his mind, something clever, something no one would expect, something that would finally put an end to this cycle without him stooping to the level of petty destruction. Mia watched him, sensing the shift. "What are you thinking?" she asked cautiously. John smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes entirely. "Let's just say, they're about to learn that I'm not as easy to push around as they think." He started gathering materials from the shed, reinforced steel, cement, wiring, and a few other odds and ends that would help him construct a mailbox that wasn't just functional. It was untouchable. The quiet hum of the neighborhood seemed to fade as he worked, replaced by a steady rhythm of determination. This wasn't about revenge. It was about asserting his presence, demanding respect, and standing up to a system that had ignored him for too long. By the time the sun was fully up, the pieces were laid out, a blueprint forming in his mind. He could hear the faint crunch of gravel as a car drove past on the main road. His neighbors were out, going about their mornings, oblivious to the storm quietly brewing at the Matthews Ranch. And John knew one thing for sure. The next time they came for his mailbox, they wouldn't see it coming. The thought made his pulse quicken. A flicker of excitement mingled with the simmering anger, because this time, it would be different. This time, he would reclaim his space, his dignity, and maybe, just maybe, teach them a lesson they wouldn't forget. As he stepped back to survey the empty patch where the mailbox once stood, a shadow moved across the far edge of his property. He squinted. A figure? A neighbor? Or someone watching, waiting for the next moment to strike? John's fingers tightened around the blueprint in his hand. "Let's see who's really running this neighborhood," he whispered. John Matthews stood at the edge of the driveway, watching the twisted remains of his mailbox glint in the sunlight. His mind replayed the same questions he'd asked himself 1,000 times. Who did this? Why? And most importantly, how long could he endure it without snapping? The thing is, John hadn't always lived under this quiet, simmering tension. He grew up in South Central Los Angeles, a place where the air itself seemed to hum with challenge. From an early age, he understood what it meant to be underestimated. Teachers overlooked him, neighbors glanced away, and yet, there was always that stubborn spark inside him, the drive to build, to claim space, to prove his worth in the face of indifference, or worse. College had been a whirlwind of late nights, cafeteria fries, and dreams that felt too big for his surroundings. But he'd made it through. Engineering degree in hand, he went straight into construction work, learning not only how to design and build structures, but also how to protect them. That knowledge, his hands-on skill, and his strategic thinking would one day help him create the ranch he had now. And this ranch, these acres of rolling hills, was more than land. It was freedom. It was a statement. A place where he could breathe without judgment, teach Mia about the sky, and remind himself every day that he'd earned the right to exist in a world that often tried to deny him space. But even paradise had its demons. The HOA, the Homeowners Association, was supposed to be a neutral body, there to maintain standards and mediate conflicts. Instead, in this neighborhood, it operated like a subtle, invisible weapon. Rules were selective. Enforcement was inconsistent. Complaints vanished into thin air. And for John, the HOA had become a revolving door of condescension and microaggression. He remembered the first confrontation vividly. It was a Wednesday morning, sunlight spilling across the council room like a spotlight on his back. He had walked in with a folder of documents, plans, and receipts, expecting a calm discussion about the mailbox. "Mr. Matthews," the HOA president, Lorraine Hargrove, said, her voice smooth but icy. She was a tall, angular woman who seemed to thrive on subtle intimidation. "We've received multiple complaints about your mailbox. It's not in line with community standards." John had nodded slowly. "I understand. I've taken the steps to adjust it. Here are the plans and photographs showing the changes I've made." She skimmed through the papers, eyes narrowing. Well, it's unique, and uniqueness is sometimes appreciated. But this is a homeowners association, not an art gallery. We have rules. Perhaps you'll consider making further adjustments? The room was quiet. A few HOA board members fidgeting in their chairs. Their polite expressions didn't reach their eyes. John felt the weight of their judgment, the subtle message. You don't belong here. He left that meeting frustrated, but calm. He tried again, painting the mailbox, shortening the post, aligning the metalwork. Each time, they found a minor fault. Each time, it didn't matter. Within days, it would be flattened, crushed, or shattered. And then, just last week, John had a run-in he would never forget. He was fixing a fence at the edge of his property when he saw one of the HOA inspectors driving slowly down the gravel road. A man in a neatly pressed uniform, clipboard in hand, his car crawling like a predator on patrol. John didn't want confrontation, but this felt personal. He set down the hammer and walked toward the road. Good morning, John called, keeping his voice steady. The man looked up, squinting against the sun. Morning, just checking in on some complaints. John's eyes narrowed. Complaints about what exactly? The man's lips pressed into a thin line. Your mailbox community standards safety hazards. John couldn't help the flicker of incredulity. Safety hazards? It's a mailbox on a post, secured with cement and steel. I've rebuilt it 3 times. Each time it gets smashed. Maybe the hazard is whoever keeps destroying it. The man hesitated, shifting uncomfortably. I'll note that. Just be careful. And with a final glance, he drove off, leaving a cloud of dust behind him. John shook his head. The absurdity of it all was enough to make his stomach turn. But beneath the irritation was a deeper, more personal anger. This wasn't about regulations or safety. This was about control, about sending a message. You're different. You don't belong here. Back at the ranch, John laid out the pieces of the destroyed mailbox on the porch table. Mia joined him, carrying a mug of hot cocoa, her small hands wrapped around the warm cup, and she looked at him with a mixture of fear and admiration. Why do they hate our mailbox so much? She asked quietly. John sighed. It's not about the mailbox, Mia. It's about us, about standing our ground, about being seen where people would rather we weren't. She frowned, thoughtful. But we live here now. We bought this place fair and square. That's the thing, John said, his voice low but intense. Sometimes fairness doesn't matter to some people. They try to make you feel like you don't belong. But we do, and we're not going anywhere. Mia nodded slowly, a spark of resolve in her young eyes. So, what will we do? John smiled, though it was tinged with weariness. We'll get smarter, stronger. We'll build something they can't touch, something they'll never expect. As night fell, the ranch grew quiet. The crickets chirped in the fields, and the occasional hoot of an owl echoed across the hills. John couldn't sleep. He walked the perimeter, eyes scanning the tree line. Shadows shifted, and he could almost imagine eyes watching from the distance, taking mental notes, waiting for the next strike. He thought back to his childhood again. All those moments when he had to prove himself, when the world said no, and he found a way to turn it into a yes. He thought about Mia, and how much of his fight was for her, to show her that dignity and strength mattered, that standing up for yourself wasn't just possible, it was necessary. A sudden creak from the edge of the property made him freeze. The wind rustled the leaves, but there was something else. Movement, a shadow slipping behind the tree line. He grabbed a flashlight and aimed it toward the darkness. Nothing, just the rustle of grass. But the message was clear. They were still out there, watching, waiting. And now, John realized he needed more than just determination. He needed strategy. He returned to the shed and started sketching ideas in the dust on a piece of plywood. Reinforced steel, hidden fastenings, cement anchors deep into the ground. Something indestructible, clever, almost mischievous. Something that would make them question their assumptions, their arrogance. Hours passed. Midnight came. And still, John worked, fueled by a mix of anger, pride, and resolve. He knew the next confrontation was coming. The HOA would send someone again. Or maybe one of the unknown vandals would strike while he slept. And when they did, John was determined that this time, they wouldn't win. Outside, the ranch lay quiet, the moon casting long shadows across the land. Inside, John's mind raced, plotting, imagining, designing, and deep down, a single thought burned like a beacon. Let's see how they handle this one. The next morning, John Matthews woke to the sound of engines rumbling down the gravel road. It wasn't unusual for tractors or delivery trucks to pass by early, but this time, the cadence felt different, calculated, deliberate. He stepped out onto his porch, rubbing the sleep from his eyes, and saw two black SUVs parked just past the edge of his property. The HOA inspectors were back. Or at least, that's what John assumed, though these vehicles looked more like enforcement than inspection. Men in crisp uniforms, badges glinting in the weak morning sun, emerged, carrying clipboards and cameras. Their eyes scanned the property as if measuring something invisible, an unspoken authority that made his stomach churn. Mia appeared beside him, her small frame dwarfed by the looming SUVs. "Dad, who are they?" she asked, voice tight. John didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked down the steps slowly, feeling the gravel underfoot crunch like a warning. "Let's see what they're up to," he muttered, keeping his tone calm, steady. Inside, his heart raced. The men stopped when they noticed him. One of them, tall, clean-shaven, and with a rigid posture, raised a hand. "Mr. Matthews, we need to inspect your mailbox again. There have been complaints." John crossed his arms. "Complaints? About what?" "The same mailbox I've rebuilt 3 times?" The man's eyes flicked toward the smashed remains lying nearby. "Community standards must be enforced. Safety hazards, property damage." His voice was clipped, rehearsed, and cold. John could feel the tension coiling in the air, thick and suffocating. This wasn't about standards. It was about control. About sending a message that he didn't belong here, that his presence could be questioned, disrupted, even erased. "Do you see any hazards here?" John asked, gesturing toward the rubble. "Or is the hazard simply me existing the way I do?" The man stiffened, and for a fraction of a second, John thought he might actually respond honestly, but the moment passed. The other man in the SUV stepped forward, snapping pictures of the debris like a predator cataloging its next attack. John clenched his jaw. "I've documented everything. Every rebuild, every complaint, every time your HOA, or someone under its influence, has destroyed my property. Are you going to address that? Or are you just going to keep sending men to intimidate me?" The taller man didn't answer. Instead, he flipped through his clipboard, muttering under his breath about regulations, community standards, and precedent. John noticed a subtle shift in their demeanor, a mixture of impatience and irritation. They weren't used to being questioned, especially by him. Mia tugged at his sleeve. "Dad, maybe we should just—" "Not yet," John said, his voice firm but gentle. "We can't let them see us scared. Not now." The two men finally left, getting back into their SUVs with a cloud of dust trailing behind them. But the damage was done. The sense of threat, of scrutiny, lingered like smoke over the ranch. John knew this wasn't a one-time thing. It would escalate. And soon, over the next few days, subtle acts of harassment continued. Flyers criticizing his property appeared on his front gate. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Heavy breathing. The faint hum of tires on gravel as cars drove slowly past his home at odd hours. Every gesture, every action, was a reminder. He was being watched, judged, challenged. But John wasn't deterred. He was fueled. Each incident sharpened his resolve to reclaim his space, to build something they couldn't break. And so, he began planning in earnest. He visited the local hardware store, scanning the aisles for materials. Reinforced steel, high-grade bolts, motion sensor lights, and hidden fasteners. Everything that could turn an ordinary mailbox into something almost impervious to destruction. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a cheerful smile, noticed his focused intensity. "That's a lot of supplies for a mailbox," the clerk said. John chuckled softly. "Yeah, well, let's just say I'm tired of rebuilding the same thing every week." The clerk nodded knowingly. "Sometimes, it's not about the mailbox. It's about standing your ground. John paused, surprised by the empathy. Exactly, he said, smiling for the first time in days. Back at the ranch, John began constructing his new mailbox with Mia by his side. They worked late into the night, the glow of a single lamp illuminating the plan spread across the porch. Cement poured into a steel-reinforced frame. Hidden sensors embedded along the sides. The final design was clever, almost mischievous, a statement as much as a utility. As they worked, John couldn't help but think about the deeper forces at play. This wasn't just about HOA rules or petty vandalism. It was a reflection of systemic bias, of the subtle ways communities could push back against those who dared to claim space. He knew that the board members weren't overtly malicious. They were polite, educated, seemingly fair. But underneath that veneer was a culture of exclusion. And John, by simply existing, had become a target. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door. He glanced at the clock. 11:30 p.m. Curious, he opened the door to find one of his neighbors, a young man named Carlos, standing there with a hesitant smile. "Hey, John thought you might need some backup," Carlos said. "I've seen the way some of those HOA folks act. Not fair, man. Not fair at all." John smiled, grateful. "Thanks, Carlos. I appreciate it. But I've got a plan. Something they won't see coming." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "Oh? Sounds serious." "It is," John admitted. "This mailbox isn't just going to withstand them. It's going to send a message. Quietly, cleanly, and in a way that reminds them that this is my land, my property, my life." Carlos nodded, impressed. "I like it. Count me in if you need an extra hand." As Carlos left, John returned to his work, hammer in hand, cement still wet. Outside, the night was quiet again. But now, it felt different, charged, electric. The air seemed thicker, as if it knew that something was about to happen. Then, a sound that made John freeze. A low, deliberate crunch of gravel under tires, not far from the porch. He turned, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness. A shadow moved across the edge of the property. Too fast, too purposeful to be a deer. John's pulse quickened. Whoever had been watching, whoever had been pushing this harassment, had returned. He crouched, observing the movements, every instinct alert. This time, he wasn't scared. He was ready. Every nail, every steel plate, every hidden sensor he had installed was part of a plan that would finally shift the balance of power. The shadow paused. John could just make out a figure, a man, leaning against a fence post, seemingly waiting for the chaos to continue, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. John whispered to Mia, who crouched beside him, heart racing. "Stay calm. They don't know what's coming." Mia nodded, gripping his arm. The night stretched on. Every creak, every whisper of wind through the trees, every distant engine sound made John's mind race. He realized that the escalation wasn't just external. It was internal, a pressure cooker of anticipation, fear, and resolve. And he knew one thing for certain. The next move had to be decisive, because the HOA wasn't going to stop. The vandals weren't going to stop. And John Matthews? He wasn't going to back down. Somewhere in the shadows, a pair of eyes watched, unaware that the game had already changed. The sun had barely crested the horizon when John Matthews returned to the porch, surveying the new mailbox. It wasn't just a mailbox anymore. It was a fortress, reinforced steel embedded in concrete, hidden brackets securing it from every angle, motion sensors wired discreetly to alert him of any interference. It wasn't about destruction. It was about proving a point. Mia leaned against his side, still rubbing sleep from her eyes. "It looks like a spaceship," she whispered. John chuckled, shaking his head. Not a spaceship, a statement. The statement was clear. John Matthews was here to stay. He stepped back, hands on his hips, admiring the ingenuity. The design was subtle, almost elegant, but the strength behind it was unmistakable. Whoever had been smashing his mailbox for months would not see this coming. Not in a million years. And John was counting on it. Later that morning, he drove into town to pick up a few finishing materials, leaving Mia to tend to the small garden behind the barn. As he returned, he noticed the familiar black SUVs idling near the entrance of the neighborhood. The men inside didn't move, didn't wave. They simply watched. John's hands tightened on the steering wheel. This was it, the moment he had anticipated. He parked casually, exited the car, and strolled toward the mailbox, as if he hadn't noticed them. From a distance, the SUV doors opened, and the same uniformed figures stepped out. Cameras, clipboards, badges, all the instruments of intimidation they'd been using for months. One of them, the taller man, smirked, a faint, condescending tilt of the head that screamed, "We're still in charge here." John ignored the smirk. He knelt by the mailbox, adjusting a small sensor, pretending to examine a bolt. "Mr. Matthews," the taller man called, voice sharp, "we need to inspect the mailbox again. Compliance standards." John looked up slowly, meeting his gaze evenly. "Inspect all you want," he said, "but I suggest you start taking notes. You're going to want a record." The man blinked, taken aback by the calm authority in John's tone. I don't understand. What's different this time?" John tapped the steel post lightly. "Everything." Suddenly, with a soft click barely audible over the morning wind, a small panel on the mailbox shifted. A camera, hidden just behind the mail slot, activated. Motion sensors triggered subtle alarms inside John's workshop. The taller man froze, realizing too late that the mailbox wasn't just a receptacle. It was a sentinel. John smiled faintly. "See, gentlemen, the mailbox isn't just a post. It's a warning. Touch it, and it lets me know. And I know everything." Mia, watching from the porch, hid a smile behind her hands. John had planned every detail. Every time it was destroyed, he had gathered data, observed patterns, and designed a mailbox that wasn't just durable. It was tactical. The man stepped closer, trying to peer into the post. "Is this legal?" John stood slowly, letting the sunlight highlight the determination in his stance. "Completely legal and completely unavoidable. You've been underestimating me for months. That ends today." The other man shifted uncomfortably, muttering about community guidelines and procedures. But John didn't wait for bureaucratic excuses. He had already anticipated them. He walked toward the driveway, motion sensor in hand, ready to demonstrate. With a single tap, the hidden camera captured their image and uploaded it to his personal system. A subtle alarm alerted him to movement around the property. The men froze, realizing they had been observed the entire time. Mia whispered, "Dad, they're panicking." John nodded, a mixture of pride and quiet satisfaction coursing through him. This was more than a mailbox. This was empowerment, a demonstration that, sometimes, ingenuity and courage could level the playing field. The taller man took a step back. "You knew?" John raised an eyebrow. "Knew what?" "You've been tracking us." "I've been preparing," John corrected, voice calm but firm. "For the day you'd come thinking you could intimidate me again. That day is today." A tense silence followed, broken only by the wind rustling through the trees. The two men exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that the game had shifted. The balance of power was no longer in their favor. "You can't," the taller man began, but John held up a hand. "I suggest you leave," John said. "Consider this your warning. The next time someone thinks they can walk onto my property and destroy what I built, it won't just be a mailbox that stands in the way. It'll be everything I prepared, and you'll be the ones exposed." For a moment, neither party moved. The air was thick, heavy, charged with the culmination of months of tension. And then, slowly, the men retreated, back to their SUVs, cameras still running, clipboards shaking slightly in their hands. John watched them go, every muscle in his body tense but controlled. He knew this wasn't the end. The HOA would escalate, rumors would spread, subtle reprisals would continue, but the first decisive shift had occurred. He returned to the porch, where Mia waited, excitement mixed with awe on her face. "Dad, you did it," she said. John sat down beside her, hands resting on his knees. "We did it, Mia. This mailbox, it's more than just metal and cement. It's a message, not just to them, but to anyone who thinks they can push us around. Mia leaned against him, eyes wide. Does this mean they'll leave us alone? John shook his head. Not necessarily. But it means they know they can't break us as easily anymore. They had to think twice. For the first time in months, John allowed himself a small sense of hope. The anger, the frustration, the countless nights spent worrying. It hadn't been wasted. Every act of destruction had been a lesson. Every insult a prompt to improve, adapt, and overcome. The mailbox, shining under the morning sun, was now a symbol of resilience, a quiet, unyielding declaration that John Matthews would not be intimidated. But the real victory wasn't just about the mailbox. It was about reclaiming his narrative, asserting his presence, and demonstrating that empowerment comes from preparation, strategy, and refusing to back down. Still, John knew better than to relax completely. The HOA and their allies were persistent, creative in their methods, and often ruthless in subtle ways. This was the major turning point, yes, but the real confrontation, the true test of endurance and cleverness, was still ahead. He looked out across the rolling hills of his property, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. Somewhere in the neighborhood, whispers were already spreading. People would talk, speculate, wonder how he had done it. John smiled faintly, the tiniest flicker of mischief in his eyes. They had underestimated him. They had assumed that persistence alone would break him. But persistence, coupled with ingenuity, had shifted the balance. And when the next attack came, and it would come, John Matthews was ready. The ranch fell quiet again. But now the quiet felt different. It was a quiet of preparation, of control regained, and of a challenge laid squarely at the feet of those who had tried to diminish him. Somewhere, hidden in the shadows of the trees lining the property, eyes watched, taking note. The HOA would not give up easily. They never did. But now, John was no longer a passive participant in their game. He was the one setting the rules, and that made all the difference. After the successful unveiling of his new mailbox, John Matthews didn't allow himself to rest. He knew better than anyone that victory was rarely permanent when dealing with people who had spent months trying to intimidate him. The HOA wouldn't give up, and the vandals, whoever they were, would surely escalate. That morning, John and Mia walked along the edge of their property, surveying the perimeter. The mailbox gleamed in the sun like a silent sentinel, cemented into place, motion sensors invisible to the untrained eye. Yet John knew that resilience alone wasn't enough. Strategy, observation, and allies were equally essential. You think they'll come back? Mia asked, glancing nervously at the tree line. John crouched down, inspecting the soil along the fence. They might, but we're not waiting for them to make the first move. We're going to be ready. Every inch of this property, every weak point, we'll cover it. Mia frowned. Like a fortress? Exactly, John said. But smarter. Not just walls and steel, information, anticipation, and patience. That's how we win. The first step was gathering intelligence. John set up a few more cameras, hidden in plain sight, in the barn, near the driveway, even tucked behind flower beds. Each camera fed directly into his secure monitor inside the barn, creating a 360-degree watch over the property. Motion sensors were calibrated to detect subtle movements. Too subtle for a casual observer to notice, but enough to alert John instantly. It wasn't just about technology. John needed allies. Carlos, the young neighbor who had offered help weeks ago, became an invaluable partner. He had a keen eye and an instinct for spotting patterns that John sometimes missed. Together, they analyzed past incidents, the time of day the mailbox was hit, the likely vehicle approach routes, and the subtle behaviors of those involved. Patterns emerged, painting a clearer picture of the harassment. I think they're mostly coming from the north entrance, Carlos said, pointing at the map spread across the barn table. And look at this. Every attack happens after 9 a.m., when most residents are at work. They're timing it deliberately. John nodded. Exactly. And that's why the next move has to be precise. We're not just defending anymore. We are controlling the narrative. Even as they planned, John couldn't ignore the psychological warfare that had been waged against him. Flyers had appeared again, anonymously, slandering his reputation in subtle, insidious ways. Messages about his property, his nonconformity, and vague threats had circulated through the neighborhood email list. It was an orchestrated campaign, meant to isolate him, make him feel vulnerable. But John refused to be cowed. Each slight became data. Each whisper, a warning. And with Carlos and Mia at his side, he started preparing for the inevitable counterattack. They tested the new mailbox over several days, observing its resilience. A baseball from Mia bounced harmlessly off its reinforced steel. The motion sensors triggered alarms, lights flickering on as if the mailbox itself were alive, watching. John's heart swelled with a quiet satisfaction. For months, they had pushed him, and now the tables had turned. Still, he knew patience was key. The HOA was patient, calculated. He had to be smarter. That meant anticipating meetings, anticipating inspections, anticipating the subtle methods they would use to challenge him. One evening, just as the sun dipped below the hills, John received a call from another neighbor, an older woman named Evelyn, who lived 3 houses down. She had observed several of the SUV patrols and HOA inspectors hovering around John's property. "They're talking about you again," Evelyn said, voice hushed. "They think you've gone too far. Some of them want to file a formal complaint. Something legal. I don't know if it's true, but you should be careful." John thanked her. The warning confirmed what he had suspected. Escalation was inevitable. The HOA wouldn't stop until they tried to push him out, or until they realized they were powerless against his preparation. Back at the ranch, John and Mia worked on reinforcing their strategy. Mia had a small radio scanner, something she had tinkered with in her free time, listening for unusual traffic or suspicious signals. John taught her how to monitor, how to observe, how to interpret patterns. This wasn't just about defense. It was a lesson in empowerment. As night fell, the ranch transformed. Motion sensor lights created subtle patterns of illumination. Cameras scanned every angle, and hidden alarms hummed quietly under the floorboards. Every possible entry point was considered. Every likely method of attack was anticipated. The property wasn't just a home. It was a carefully planned stage for the next confrontation. And then came the first sign that their planning was working. A week later, around dusk, John and Mia were monitoring the cameras when movement was detected near the northern fence line. A shadowy figure approached, trying to move silently. John held his breath, watching as the sensors detected the intruder. A light flicked on, illuminating the figure, who froze instantly, realizing they had been seen. "Got you," John whispered, almost to himself. The intruder retreated quickly, disappearing into the trees. It was a small victory, but a powerful one. For the first time in months, John felt a sense of control. They were not invisible. They were being watched. Their attempts at intimidation were no longer one-sided. The next morning, John called Carlos. "They came back last night," he said, "and they ran." "That's progress," Carlos laughed. "Finally, some feedback. Let's document everything, every move. This is the proof we need if they escalate to complaints or legal action." John nodded. Proof was important, but so was psychology. The message being sent to the HOA and the vandals was clear. You cannot intimidate us. You cannot predict us. You cannot control us. But with victory came a sobering realization. The more they resisted, the harder the confrontation would get. The stakes were rising, and John knew that eventually, a direct showdown was inevitable. The difference now was that he and Mia were prepared, and they had allies. They had strategy, and most importantly, they had confidence. Even so, John couldn't shake a flicker of unease. In the shadows of the ranch, figures moved. Surveillance wasn't perfect. People were unpredictable. The HOA might escalate in ways he hadn't anticipated. Legal threats, manipulation, even community pressure. These were all tools they could wield. But for the first time, John realized something crucial. He didn't have to meet aggression with aggression. He could outsmart them, outplan them, and maintain dignity while doing it. That mindset, more than any steel or sensor, was his true advantage. That night, as he sat on the porch with Mia, the stars stretched across the sky like a canopy of silent witnesses. He watched her small hands tracing the edges of the railing, her expression thoughtful. "Mia, he said softly. What we're doing isn't just about a mailbox. It's about showing that we don't have to accept being pushed around, about standing up for ourselves in ways that are smart, deliberate, and unbreakable. She nodded, eyes wide. We'll win, won't we? John smiled, placing a hand over hers. We already are. Every step we take, every move we anticipate, we're winning. And the best part? They don't even see it coming. Outside, the ranch settled into a quiet hum, the sounds of crickets and distant owls mixing with the occasional rustle of leaves. But beneath that calm, the tension of the upcoming showdown simmered. The HOA would respond. The Vandals would return. And when they did, John Matthews and his family would be ready, because the confrontation wasn't just approaching, it was building. And when it exploded, John knew it would change everything. The morning air was thick with anticipation. John Matthews stood on his porch, the sunlight glinting off the steel mailbox like a warning beacon. Every inch of the ranch had been monitored, every sensor calibrated, every camera strategically positioned. Months of harassment, months of intimidation had led to this moment. Mia appeared beside him, her small frame tense but resolute. Dad, it's them, she whispered. John nodded. Stay calm. Remember what we practiced. In the distance, the black SUVs rolled down the gravel road, engines low but purposeful. The HOA had arrived, accompanied by a second vehicle filled with men whose presence was unmistakably menacing. For months, they had underestimated him. Today, that would change. As the SUVs slowed near the entrance, the HOA president herself stepped out, Lorraine Hargrove, flanked by two board members and what appeared to be a contractor with tools. Their expressions were carefully controlled, polite on the surface, but cold beneath. John took a deep breath. All right, Mia, he said softly. We show them we're ready, not aggressive, just prepared. They approached the mailbox, cameras capturing every movement. The HOA president inspected it, her brow furrowed. Mr. Matthews, she said, voice tight, we have received multiple complaints. Your mailbox, this structure, does not comply with our regulations. We need to take action immediately. John's hand rested lightly on the reinforced steel. Action? He repeated, voice calm but firm. You mean destroy it again? Lorraine's eyes flickered, a brief flash of annoyance. We have authority here. You've been warned multiple times. John stepped closer, motion sensors lighting up, the hidden cameras whirring quietly. And yet, it stands, he said, gesturing to the mailbox. Every attempt you've made has failed. Every threat, every complaint, every subtle intimidation. None of it has moved me, and I suggest it doesn't move you either. Not today. A board member cleared his throat. We were not expecting these sensors. This reinforcement. Exactly, John said, voice rising slightly, not in anger, but in controlled conviction. You've underestimated me. You assumed persistence alone would break me, but you didn't anticipate preparation, ingenuity, dignity, all of which I bring, every day, to this land I have earned. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Lorraine's face remained neutral, but the tension in her shoulders betrayed her. For months, she had assumed control. Today, her control was slipping. Then, a subtle sound, an almost inaudible beep, emanated from the mailbox. Motion sensors had detected their proximity. Lights flickered on in a pattern that highlighted the perimeter of the property. Cameras pivoted automatically, capturing clear images of everyone on the lawn. Every movement was documented, every gesture recorded. John raised his hand slightly, demonstrating calm authority. You see, this isn't just about a mailbox. It's about accountability. It's about showing that you cannot intimidate, you cannot threaten, and you cannot erase someone who has the right to exist in this community. Lorraine opened her mouth to respond but paused. The hidden cameras had captured everything. The sensors had logged every step. John could already imagine the reports, the evidence, the undeniable proof that any attempt to challenge him now would reflect poorly on the HOA, their methods, and their motives. Then, the Vandals appeared. Two figures, moving from the tree line near the northern fence, carrying what looked like tools or bats. They had waited for months, hoping for another opportunity. But John had anticipated them. A sharp light cut across the field, triggered by motion detection. The vandals froze, squinting against the glare. Hidden cameras captured their every move. John spoke loudly, projecting across the yard. "Step back. You've been observed. Everything you do here is recorded. Leave now, or the consequences will be public, legal, and inescapable." The vandals hesitated, exchanging glances. The realization hit. They were no longer in control. The fear in their stance was visible, almost palpable. Mia, sensing the danger but remembering her father's teachings, stepped forward slightly, her small voice firm. "Go home. You can't win here." The combination of the technological setup, John's presence, and Mia's unexpected bravery created an unshakable tableau. The vandals slowly retreated, disappearing into the trees, leaving their tools behind. John turned back to the HOA, who were now visibly shaken. Lorraine's usual composure had cracked, replaced by frustration and disbelief. "Mr. Matthews, you can't just." "I can," John interrupted, calm and steady. "And I did. For months, you've tried to bully, intimidate, and control. For months, I've prepared. Today, you see the result. You can either respect it, or you can escalate further, knowing that every action will be documented, observed, and exposed." The tension hung in the air like a taut wire, waiting to snap. But finally, Lorraine exhaled sharply. "Very well," she said, voice tight. "We will review this, but understand, this is not over." John nodded once, not in submission, but acknowledgement. "Understood. But today, it ends." For now, the SUVs retreated slowly, dust rising behind them. The vandals had disappeared into the shadows. Silence reclaimed the ranch. John exhaled, his body finally relaxing after months of tension. Mia ran to his side, hugging him tightly. "Dad, you did it," she said. "I did it," John corrected gently, embracing her. "But we did it. Together." He walked around the mailbox, inspecting the sensors, the reinforced steel, the hidden cameras. Everything had functioned exactly as planned. Every attempt at intimidation, every harassment tactic, had been countered with preparation, strategy, and calm courage. For the first time in months, the ranch felt like what it had always been meant to be: a sanctuary, a place of dignity, safety, and pride. John looked out across the rolling hills, imagining the HOA board members regrouping, trying to formulate a new plan. They had been met with intelligence, foresight, and unyielding resolve, elements they had failed to consider in their months of harassment. He realized something crucial. This confrontation was more than a victory over an organization. It was a lesson in empowerment. It was a message to anyone who had been underestimated, pushed around, or dismissed. Preparation, intelligence, and courage could level even the most entrenched systems of control. Mia leaned against him, eyes wide. "Will they come back?" "They might," John admitted. "But now they know they can't just push us around. And that changes everything." The ranch, bathed in the golden afternoon light, felt almost sacred. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call, every faint hum of the hidden cameras seemed to celebrate the triumph. John knew the road ahead wasn't without challenges. The HOA could still escalate legally, socially, or politically, but the power balance had shifted irrevocably. For the first time, he held control, and that made all the difference. As night fell, John and Mia sat on the porch, the mailbox standing as a silent guardian. The events of the day had been exhausting, intense, and transformative, yet there was a sense of calm, an understanding that the confrontation had been won not through aggression, but through preparation, strategy, and unshakable dignity. John's eyes lingered on the mailbox, a symbol of resilience. He thought of all the nights he had spent worrying, planning, and rebuilding. Every moment had led to this crescendo, the perfect balance of justice, empowerment, and victory. Tonight, the ranch was theirs. The fight wasn't entirely over, but for the first time, John felt an unshakable truth. They had won the battle, and when the next challenge came, they would face it with the same intelligence, courage, and dignity that had brought them this far. The shadows of the hills seemed to bow in respect, the air charged with a quiet sense of triumph. John Matthews had faced intimidation, harassment, and systemic bias, and emerged stronger, smarter, and unbroken. The climax had been reached. The turning point had arrived, and the message was clear. Resilience, preparation, and dignity could not be destroyed. The morning after the confrontation, the ranch felt different. The air was lighter, though tension still lingered, like the echo of a storm that had passed but left its mark. John Matthews stood on the porch, hands resting on the railing, surveying his property. The mailbox gleamed in the sunlight, unscathed, a silent monument to the night before. Mia joined him, her eyes wide with a mix of pride and lingering worry. "Dad, do you think they'll come back?" she asked softly. John shook his head. "Maybe. Maybe not. But it doesn't matter. Today, we proved something important. We proved that we are not powerless, that we can stand our ground without giving up our dignity." The ranch was quiet, but John noticed subtle changes. Neighbors were walking their dogs, giving him cautious nods or brief smiles. Some had heard about the previous day's showdown. Rumors traveled faster than anyone realized. The narrative was shifting. John's perseverance was no longer a story of victimhood. It was a story of empowerment. He stepped down from the porch and walked along the driveway, checking the cameras, reviewing footage from the confrontation. Every movement of the HOA and the vandals had been captured. Their hesitation, their retreat, and their unease. It was all there. Undeniable proof of their failed intimidation. Carlos arrived shortly afterward, his truck kicking up dust as he parked near the barn. "Morning, John," he said, stepping out. "I saw the aftermath from my place. The HOA is scrambling. People are talking." John nodded. "Good. Let them talk. Let the truth be seen. It's time the narrative reflects reality." Carlos grinned. "I like the sound of that. And the mailbox. Wow. That thing's a fortress. No one's getting through it now." Mia laughed quietly. "I told you it looked like a spaceship." John chuckled. "It is a spaceship. In a way, it's taking us to a new place. One where we don't have to live in fear of arbitrary rules or intimidation." Later that day, John received an unexpected visit from Evelyn, the elderly neighbor who had warned him earlier about potential legal action. She carried a basket of homemade muffins and wore a tentative smile. "I just wanted to check in," she said. "And well, to bring some peace offerings I heard about yesterday." John invited her in, and they sat on the porch, the wind rustling through the trees. "It was intense," John admitted, "but it needed to happen. They've underestimated us for too long." Evelyn nodded thoughtfully. "I've seen them before. People who think they can control others without consequence. You've shown them that can't always happen. And you did it with intelligence, not anger. That matters." John smiled faintly. "Thank you, Evelyn. That's exactly the point. We can't always change how people act, but we can control our response. That's where power lies." Meanwhile, the HOA board was regrouping. Lorraine Hargrove, the president, called a meeting with her members in a small conference room. Voices were low, but the tension was palpable. "We were blindsided," one board member said, shaking his head. "We underestimated him. The sensors, the cameras. It's like he knew exactly what we do." Lorraine rubbed her temples. "This isn't just about a mailbox anymore. It's about control, perception, and the community seeing us as ineffective. We need to rethink our approach. And fast." Another board member frowned. "Do we escalate legally? Take him to court?" Lorraine's expression hardened. "Be careful. Any action we take now will be scrutinized. He is proof. He's documenting everything. One wrong move and it could backfire, big time." Back at the ranch, John continued his review of the footage. The vandals' movements were deliberate but predictable, and the HOA's tactics were transparent under the scrutiny of his cameras. He realized that the aftermath of this confrontation wasn't just about defense. It was about reputation, perception, and narrative control. That afternoon, a few neighbors approached the property, curious but cautious. Some had never spoken to John before, but the events of the past days had shifted their perspective. "Mr. Matthews," one neighbor said, a middle-aged man holding a leash for his dog. I, I just wanted to say, I saw what happened. That was impressive. You stood your ground. Calm, smart, it was inspiring. John nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement. Thank you. That means a lot. I hope it shows everyone that you don't have to accept intimidation or injustice in silence. Mia watched from the porch, a quiet pride in her eyes. She had seen her father face down months of harassment, plan meticulously, and execute with confidence. For her, it was a lesson in courage, intelligence, and dignity. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the ranch felt alive with a sense of accomplishment. The confrontation had shifted the power dynamic, and while the HOA and vandals were still potential threats, they had been shown that John Matthews was not someone to be underestimated. That evening, John sat with Mia and Carlos around a small fire pit. The glow of the flames danced across their faces as they discussed the day's events. They'll be talking about this for months, Carlos said, tossing a small stick into the fire. And honestly, I think it's about time. People need to see someone stand up the right way. Mia added softly, it's not just about the mailbox anymore, is it? It's about standing up for yourself. John nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. Exactly. The mailbox was the tool, but the lesson is bigger. Courage, preparation, and dignity can change how people interact with you, and it can change the community around you too. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the cool evening air. John reflected on the months of struggle, the smashed mailboxes, the late-night fears, the anonymous threats. Every act of harassment had been a test, and every test had taught him how to respond smarter, stronger, and with more integrity. And the best part? He hadn't had to compromise who he was to win. He looked around at Mia and Carlos, two people who had shared in his struggle and triumph. Their support had been invaluable, but the real victory was internal. It was knowing that he had faced adversity head-on and emerged empowered, not embittered. As night fully descended, John glanced at the mailbox one last time before heading inside. It stood firm, a symbol of the confrontation, the resilience, and the dignity he had fought to uphold. Somewhere in the neighborhood, whispers were spreading. The HOA would reconsider its strategies. The vandals would think twice before returning.